Hey guys, what is up? It's Public back with another video, and today is the last series, or I guess official series in our guide for Shadow Priest for Shadowlands launch. We've gone over raiding, talents, prep, everything you can talk about, and today is the kind of culmination of that. This is the Mythic Plus video. We're going to go over everything you need to know to play Shadow Priest inside of Mythic Plus, and all the little tips and tricks I can give you guys to be successful. Alright, let's get started. Alright guys, so if you saw my kind of opening video when I did Castle Nathri, this will be a little different than that because we're going things in the Mythic Dungeons are a little different than raiding, especially considering we have a lot of options now that we actually did not have, especially, last season's keys or even all throughout BFA for the most part. And most of that's going to come down to talents and our kind of core build being better suited for Mythic Plus. And ironically enough, the target capping that happened to a lot of the melee DPS has actually given us a pretty hefty avenue since most of our stuff, in fact, all of it's pretty much uncapped AoE. So the first thing I want to talk about is kind of like your generic getting started build for Mythic Plus. I'll put up that over here. You've probably already seen this if you watched the talent video, so I'm not going to go too in depth over this, but for the most part, this is actually pretty cookie cutter for what I would run inside of Mythic Plus. Generally speaking, I don't change a single thing going from key to key. The kind of standard of Death and Madness, Body and Soul, that's kind of the two definites. Level 30 rows, this is the one where it's either Misery or Searing Nightmare, although it is still mostly Searing Nightmare. Level 35 row, it's either Last Word or Psychic Horror based on what your group needs. Level 40 row is pretty much always going to be Shadow Crash. The thing is just amazing for keys. And then level 45 row is going to be Mindbender or Void Torrent. And last but not least, likely Surrender to Madness for all the keys that you're doing. Now, a couple things I want to highlight with this build before I get into the specifics of the crazy ones. You could run Hungering Void if you're not a big fan of Surrender to Madness. Although I would say once you get used to running Surrender, it is just far superior in my eye from an overall DPS perspective. Even if you're on a week of Tyrannical, I've done a bunch of keys over 15 and 15 on Tyrannical stuff. Having Surrender to Madness for most bosses is actually pretty nice. Almost every boss that's actually inside of a dungeon has something where you can like snipe an ad or whatever to get an extra Void Form proc. And if you just couple that together, it just feels great to have that. Now again, if you still think Hungering Void makes sense or you're kind of shaky on Surrender, that's okay. I would probably never really run Ancient Madness. There are some people that are trying it, but again, I think Surrender to Madness is going to win heartily anytime that you can use it confidently. A couple other things we want to talk about here, Misery versus Searing Nightmare. This is probably the biggest question mark a lot of you guys have. Some of you might not even like playing with Searing Nightmare. I would say that, generally speaking, this row is giving us something that we don't have in our base toolkit, which is large burst AoE with Searing Nightmare. Especially if you couple in all the Insanity Generation stuff from Talents or Legendaries. This is just giving us a huge amount of AoE. Is it going to be like topping packs all the time? No, but it's always going to be there. There's no cooldown on it. You just need Insanity. And this is about giving us that kind of overall damage of the key that is uncapped AoE, which is very, very strong. Couple that up with Shadow Crash. Shadow Crash gives us another uncapped AoE button that gives us a large chunk of Insanity. All these things are kind of the big keys missing from our toolkit, which is why I like taking Searing Nightmare. Now that being said, Misery is still a competitive talent. It can do okay damage. The problem is it's just whenever you get to like 3 or 4 targets consistently every pull, that's where Searing Nightmare starts to win. Now if you think about like all the dungeons that we have, very few dungeons have consistently packs of like 3 or 4 mobs or less. And there's only really 2 dungeons that come to my mind specifically, which is Theater of Pain and Spires of Ascension. Both of these dungeons, do have some pulls that are more than 3 or 4 mobs, but I would say the vast majority of them are 3, 4, or less mobs, which is why I typically run Misery for those keys. Now, Misery does give us a little bit of an extra boost on boss damage. We typically don't take Searing Nightmare for boss damage, but again, the difference is so minimal. I would even say, don't feel bad about taking Searing Nightmare even on Tyrannical weeks. The difference between that and Misery is usually not a big deal on bosses, and again, kind of just depends on what you're doing. Now, again, the reason why I say that with Spires of Ascension, you could go Misery here. This one's a bit more up in the air than I think of Theater and Pain's a bit more locked in my opinion. Simply because with Spires, if it's not a fortified week, you can actually do some pretty good like double pulls of that dungeon. And there are a few pulls that do have, 8, 9, or even 10 mobs if you do that. And so because of that, this is why it's kind of a question mark. So I would communicate with your group. How aggressive are you going to be pulling? What do you guys want to do here? Do you need that damage here? Or would you rather have Misery for the smaller packs? Because you gotta really keep in mind, who are you running with, right? Like, are you running with a marksmanship hunter that doesn't do as well on 2 targets or whatever else your DPS is? And you want to make sure that you can fill those gaps because we do have those choices here. But again, far and beyond, you're going to be taking Searing Nightmare for almost every key that you're doing. This is your bread and butter for sure. The last talent thing I want to talk about is Mindbender versus Void Torrent. So actually, I mean, for almost all the keys that I've done currently on live, I've used Void Torrent. I think Mindbender does have a good place for some fortified weeks when you're pulling a lot of trash consistently. But personally, I love having Void Torrent, one, for the priority target damage it gives me on trash packs that I really want to kill a certain mob right now, which can be helpful if, like, you know, the tank's getting destroyed by a certain thing. It's also great for Prideful, and it's great for almost every boss fight. And I think, you know, again, this is where you want to change up what you're doing based on your group. If your group is kind of lacking a bit of single target, but they're, you know, still a little bit hybrid or whatever, Void Torrent is a great thing to fill that gap. Mindbender, however, on single target, while it is okay, it's nowhere near close to what Void Torrent's going to bring you there, right? Mindbender is really just there to give you passive insanity generation while you're doing your Searing Nightmare and Mind Seer spamming, which can be good, again, if you're doing large packs consistently, but you're going to notice it lacking on boss damage. Now, because of that, there's a couple things I do want to cover as well before we get into kind of more nitty-gritty stuff with our cooldowns, because, again, cooldowns is really the big point of our damage here. So a couple things I want to bring up here are legendary effects, now that we've covered talents. So for the most part, I'm running Twins of the Sun Priestess on almost every key. Now, I'm doing that because Twins is great because I have an Unholy Death Knight and a Marksmanship Hunter that I run with most of my keys. And generally speaking, I PI the Marksmanship Hunter on trash. He destroys trash. That trash pack, at least, when we do cooldown together. And then the Unholy DK for bosses to just blast the boss there. Now, that being said, if there's ever a dungeon where I feel like the PI timings aren't working out very well, or maybe it's fortified, then I do pop in an Eternal Call of the Void there. This is very kind of dungeon dependent or key dependent on where we need that damage. Unfortunately, our legendaries just aren't that amazing for keys, so which is why I run Twins of the Sun Priestess for a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, because it benefits my group. Now, if I've done keys with like maybe a Warlock and a Marksmanship Hunter, I'm a little bit less inclined to run Twins because the syncing is a bit less natural. If you have to hold your cooldowns too much by using Twins, probably wasn't worth it in the first place. So depending on your team comp and kind of where you guys have cooldowns when they're synced with you, it might be better to not run Twins and run Eternal Call of the Void instead. Marksmanship Hunter works very well for this because they also have a 2-minute cooldown to sync with us, which is great, which is why I like using it there. But again, guys, either one of those two will do you guys pretty well. I will say kind of honorable mentions to, like, if you want to run like something like Norganons to help with movement, that could be good for specific situations. But generally speaking, there's really not another great option here. I know some of you guys were like, well, what about Shadowflame Prism with a Mindbender Rabid Shadows build? Generally speaking, this is not a good idea. Even with Shadowflame Prism on, you would still swap to Searing Nightmare at 3 and 4 targets. It doesn't really change with Shadowflame Prism. It does not do that much damage. More importantly, it also doesn't scale with our mastery. So unfortunately, that legendary just doesn't work at all right now. Maybe on a dungeon like Theater of Pain, you could run Shadowflame Prism and get some good results with it. But outside of that, guys, it's not going to be worth crafting, in my opinion. At least, hopefully it gets buffed or they fix the mastery bug with it. Until then, these are the legendaries we're running. And guys, the last thing I want to cover is Conduits and Covenant stuff. So I already did a video on what Covenant that you should pick for your Shadow Priest, so check that out if you haven't. The TLDR of that, I think for the most part, and a lot of you guys have already done this, are either probably Necrolord or Venthyr for keys. Necrolord is definitely the superior Covenant for keys for sure. That being said, you can still do great results as a Venthyr or even a Nightfey or even a Kyrian. It's just kind of what you want to specialize your specific character in. But you can make it work with whatever you're doing. I have specific builds for all the Soulbinds and Conduits for Mythic Plus on the Icy Veins guide, so make sure you guys check that out in the description if you want to figure out what specific builds that you want to run. This does kind of change up based on your renown level, but for the most part, they're going to be the same regardless of that. But just wanted to call that out. And then last but not least is the Conduit selection I want to go over real quick. For the most part in Mythic Plus, you are free to run Dissonant Echoes or Haunting Apparitions. Either one's going to be good for dungeons, or I guess okay at best. Our Conduits, again, aren't that big of a DPS increase. You'll find this is kind of a pattern. Our Borrowed Power isn't that great, but between one of the two, it doesn't really matter. I run Dissonant Echoes for a lot of this stuff. I find the cutoff for Void Bolt is a little bit easier with that Conduit in there, as well as just, again, getting that priority target damage or the boss damage prideful with Void Bolt is always really nice to have. That being said, Haunting Apparitions is probably the better Conduit in terms of overall key damage. The only caveat there is, the mobs have to actually live for long enough time for those spirits to actually get there. And you have to be casting spells that are sending spirits at mobs, which for the most part in AoE is either going to be Void Bolt or Mind Blast with Dark Thought procs. It's not going to happen that often. which is why I usually don't swap it out and just stick with Dissonant Echoes. It's not really that big of a deal. Our other conduits don't make that big of a deal of a difference, so I pretty much stick with my rating build for this one. We actually get much more value out of the potency and finesse conduits, or sorry, the finesse and endurance conduits, with the fade trait giving us a little mini DR, which is very helpful for tyrannical weeks, as well as the finesse conduit to help with dispels out, reducing the mana cost of dispelling. You will find yourself dispelling a lot in Mythic Plus, so this is a very good conduit for that. Alright guys, that is it for kind of the setup for Mythic Plus, so let's move on to cooldown usage inside of dungeons. Alright guys, let's talk about cooldowns as a Shadow Priest inside of Mythic Plus. This is basically the most important section of this guide, is understanding how to use your cooldowns and how to do your rotation correctly inside of Mythic Plus. Now, we are actually kind of benefited a lot with the rework inside of Mythic Plus in that our major DPS is now tied to cooldowns rather than just kind of passive damage as we ramp up. So because of that, we have things like Void Eruption, Surrender to Madness, Shadow Fiend, and Power Infusion as all of our kind of big cooldowns that we can use effectively. Now, of course, anytime that we can sync these up, that's always a good thing. But because of the way that we're kind of pulling dungeons and using kind of other DPS as well, you do need to think about what everyone else is doing in addition to what your own cooldowns are for, right? So specifically what I mean, you want to communicate with your group who's going to be cooldowning where, right? If everyone's using Void Form, Power Infusion, all their cooldowns like APOC and, Wild Spirits, whatever it is, right? All in the same pack, it's probably going to get deleted in like 5 or 10 seconds. Maybe that's something that you want to do for like a Fortified Key or something else like that. But typically everyone using all their cooldowns every time is probably not worth it. Now, that being said, as a Shadow Priest, since our cooldowns are so short and we do have a lot of them, especially if you're running Surrender to Madness and getting good usage out of that, you're going to have Void Form or Surrender to Madness for basically every pull that you're doing inside of a dungeon. And this is very powerful, guys. I know it's going to look a little even discouraging at times if you're just looking at the DPS meter from pull to pull to pull. But generally speaking, because we have so many cooldowns available and up for every single pack that we're doing, the overall damage is going to keep going up, and I've found myself directly competing with Unholy Death Knights and Marksmanship Hunters on almost every key that we're doing, very neck and neck with them. Especially if you kind of factor in some of the Twins of the Sun Priestess PI damage that I'm giving these other DPS classes. So don't be too discouraged. You're really there to pump out, consistent damage in every pack. And the way that we're able to do that is by maximizing the uptime of our cooldowns. But again, that being said, you want to coordinate with your group members, like what they're doing. This is actually especially important if you decide to run Twins like I do for a lot of my keys, because if you're just giving someone else Power Infusion but then not getting good usage of it out of it yourself, that's actually, again, a little bit of a waste of a cooldown, right? You want to make sure that, both you and the person you're giving it to are both blasting on that pull and not over blasting it, because that would be bad. Now, this also works out very, very well because we have things like Void Torrent and Shadow Crash as kind of even smaller little cooldowns to kind of help bridge the gap between our next Void Form and next Surrender to Madness. So you can use these guys to coordinate all these other cooldowns with your group members. Now, especially in Season 1, this is actually super important because we have the Prideful affix. Now, a lot of people like to pull Prideful either right before a very scary trash pack or, proc it right before a boss. And these are both great things to do. However, you want to make sure that, especially on these higher keys, if no one cooldowns the Prideful mob, that's actually pretty bad, right? You want to make sure that the Prideful's dying in a timely manner. Otherwise, your healer's not going to be best friends with you. They're going to be very upset with you indeed. Which is why you can use things like Surrender to Madness, Void Torrent, and Shadow Crash to kind of, use some cooldowns on the Prideful without sacrificing the larger cooldowns like Void Torrent and Power Infusion for the bosses. So you want to make sure that you're kind of constantly kind of working with your group, like who has cooldowns where. If you see in the footage below me, I actually track the Death Knight's cooldowns to the left of my damage meter. And for some of the stuff, I even track my Hunters as well to make sure that I know, like, oh, hey, he's blasting this pull. I'm going to rein myself back a little bit because I know I'll need to blast the pull after that. And getting effective use out of that is the best way to kind of time keys in dungeons. You're not just there to pad the damage meter, right? This is very, very important. So outside of that, guys, the only thing I want to cover there with cooldowns that are maybe a little bit less intuitive. So Void Torrent, again, if you're running Void Torrent, generally speaking, you're going to stop casting this once you're pulling these large pools of 5-6 mobs. It's really there for priority target or funneling damage. So even if you see me using this on a big AoE pack, that's probably because my group has communicated like, hey, this mob is really hurting me. We need to kill this right now. Or maybe I want to kill things evenly from like a bolstering perspective. So that in that case, I would stop casting Searing Nightmares and really funnel it there. Otherwise, it's pretty much going to be there for single target stuff and bosses. Some other things we want to talk about is Shadow Fiend and Mindbender. For the most part, guys, these things are going to be used on cooldown. You do want to make sure that you're using it, effectively with Power Infusion and or Bloodlust whenever possible. It does benefit from those haste increases. So that being said, make sure you're keeping an eye on, like, communicating with your group, right? Okay, hey, when are we lusting? Oh, we're lusting in 4 minutes. Great. That means I have time for a Shadow Fiend, right? Oh, hey, we're going to lust the next pull. Maybe I hold my Shadow Fiend, right? These are very important questions you want to ask because otherwise you can use those cooldowns. Again, the more you can use them, the more damage you're going to do, the better things are going to be. Guys, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of cooldowns, and this is mostly just rehashing from the rotation video. If you haven't seen that, definitely suggest checking that out because this is also very important, is with Searing Nightmare. This is your bread and butter for Mythic Plus. This is where most of your damage is going to come from, especially on fortified keys, talking like 20-30% of your damage on fortified weeks, more like 15 or 20 on tyrannical weeks, maybe even lower, depends on what you're doing. So with Searing Nightmare, it's very, very important that you're only doing 2 Searing Nightmare casts inside of a single Mindseer channel. And basically the rotation is going to follow, 2 Searing Nightmare, Mindseer, 2 Searing Nightmares, do maybe a Void Bolt or Vampiric Touch, and then restart that loop with Mindseer, 2 Searing Nightmares. You can use this kind of time in between those kind of double Searing Nightmares to either generate some more insanity with like a Shadow Crash cast in between those two, that kind of cycle. You can also do some kind of off dotting. Now, dotting here is going to be very, very important with and without Void Form here. So Vampiric Touch is going to be the most awkward dot in your kind of playstyle right now. That's going to be a bit less intuitive, I think, especially for newer players about, hey, when should I be casting Vampiric Touch on mobs inside of Mythic Plus? This is a very hard question to answer inside of a video. I'm going to do some more videos in the future kind of going over, hey, I'm going into this pull, this is my thought process. But basically, your goal is to have Vampiric Touch on as many mobs as possible, as long as they're going to live long enough to pump a few Searing Nightmares into. Now, what that time is like is you're just guessing. That's every single time you're going into a pack, you're like, hey, I think this is going to live long enough to get value out of it. And that's really just going to come with practice inside of keys. There's not like a set weak order to tell you, yeah, you need to dot these mobs. Like, you need to actually kind of determine that yourself and make a good guess. Now, generally speaking, because of that, Fade is going to be your best friend here for dotting up mobs getting ready to do some Searing Nightmares, because what's usually going to happen, especially if you're chain pulling, so a good example of this is like the first pull into other side, where you're doing like the 2 mobs at the top of the stairs and then lusting all the big guys down below. You can go ahead and start dotting the 2 mobs at the front, kind of moving with the tank, dotting as he's pulling targets, but using that opening Fade to make sure you're not getting aggro from that. Getting up those kind of pre-setup Vampiric Touches is going to give you a great mastery benefit for all those targets. Or if you are in Void Form, you still get the extra ticking damage, which is great. And again, once you get out of Void Form, it's going to be even better. So because of that, you want to be pretty aggressive with getting Vampiric Touch out on as many mobs as possible. But you need to be careful, because if the mobs are going to live like 5-6 seconds, you're only going to get like 2 Searing Nightmares off. By the time you've dotted everything, they've all died, right? So you need to be very careful about that. You want to make sure that you're casting it at the right time, especially with that Searing Nightmare talent. Now, that being said, if you are taking Misery for that Theater of Pain or Spires of the Ascension key, this is pretty much kind of a no-brainer, kind of a bit easier to play with. You're pretty much just going to be a Devouring Plague, Vampiric Touch machine. You want to make sure basically every target is dotted, and you want to be casting as many Devouring Plagues as possible. So that you kind of have these 2 builds that are, both play a little, pretty differently actually, because one is you're using Devouring Plagues a lot, the other one you're using Searing Nightmare a lot. So you want to make sure you're playing both as effective as possible. And again, I'm going to do my best to upload some more POVs of my specific kind of, okay, here's what I'm doing going into this pull and things like that. But getting those dots up on targets is going to just mean the world for your damage there. All right, guys, before we move on to utility and kind of the wrap-up stuff of this video, I do want to mention with Devouring Plague specifically, if you are using Searing Nightmare, you want to make sure you're using these guys at the correct cutoff points. I already covered the kind of cheat sheet for AoE. You want to make sure you keep this in mind. If this is a little difficult to read, the TLDR here is that you're going to keep casting Devouring Plague on 1 to 2 targets. It's going to be your only spender on that target amount. Once you break into 3 targets, that's when you can start using Searing Nightmare. However, if you're only fighting 3 targets and you're inside of Void Form, that's when you go back to using Devouring Plague again. So 3 targets in Void Form, Devouring Plague, 3 targets out of Void Form or more, Searing Nightmare. And then again, once you hit 4 targets, it's Searing Nightmare everything. But you do need to be careful here, right? Because some of these packs, if you are like fighting 4 or 5 mobs, but only 3 are stacked up and you're in Void form, again, that's when you want to swap to Devouring Plague, because you have to actually hit those mobs with Searing Nightmare, right? Or specifically the Mind Sphere to make sure you get enough Insanity Generation to make that an effective cast for you to do. All right, that is it for the kind of the rotation stuff and the cooldown stuff we want to cover. Let's go over utility real quick. All right, guys, let's talk about utilities of Shadow Priest. This is definitely the kind of weirdest part of the video, and there's really not a whole lot to talk about here, but I want to give a little bit of a spiel of, a reason to bring a Shadow Priest to keys on live right now. I've given a lot of feedback on what I think could be due to like improve this relative to other range specs, but we do still have a lot of stuff that I think not a lot of people take full advantage of that can really make or break certain parts of the key, especially inside of Shadowlands. So the first thing I want to bring up is Power Word Fortitude. It sounds kind of silly, but if you're not running with a priest healer, getting that extra stamina is a very nice boost to your group. Yeah, it's only 5%, but since we don't have scrolls to make up for that anymore, this can actually be very, very helpful on tyrannical keys when things are doing quite a lot of damage. So don't shake that off. It's still a very valuable point of utility. Now, new with Shadowlands, we get Mind Soothe, which is actually, funnily enough, like randomly pretty helpful. I wouldn't say it's like consistently a great tool, except in maybe like, very specific packs in certain dungeons. But if you don't know, Mind Soothe is a castable ability that can go on humanoids and I believe dragonkins, which is, again, an artifact from Classic, I believe. That lets you effectively walk past them where you normally would aggro them. So kind of similar to like a group Shroud of Concealment or like maybe a sap or a hard CC ability. Mind Soothe lets you easily walk past certain mobs. Again, the distance isn't that small, but it is pretty nice. Now, kind of coupling that with that is Fade. So Fade actually has several uses right now. In addition to the use I mentioned before about it being an aggro drop for you personally to help you dot quicker, you can also use the translucent image conduit I mentioned earlier to give Fade a little bit of a mini damage reduction when cast, which is again very nice for specific tyrannical boss mechanics or other things. Now, the other thing Fade is also somewhat helpful for relative to Mind Soothe as well, it is also an aggro drop. So you can use Fade to you yourself get past something you normally would not be able to, which can be helpful for certain things that you're doing. But again, that one's a bit more better for open world rather than Mythic Plus, because usually if you're getting past it, you need the rest of your group to get past it as well. So depending on what covenant or whatever else they are, that might be a little difficult. The other thing I want to bring up here that's very, very big in terms of utility is Dispels. So you want to be very on top of Dispels here. Make sure it's on a great keybind, sorry, not coolbind. But basically, you want to be able to dispel things quickly and often. We don't really spend mana on our rotational abilities, so we have that mana reserved for the most part for either resing, healing, or dispelling, which is the main one. And if you use the conduit to reduce the amount of mana that dispels cost, it's going to be even easier. So you want to make sure you have Dispel Magic, Purify Disease, and Mass Dispel easily available for you somewhere on your keyboard layout, because you're going to cast these a lot. And if you're not, that's a big thing that you can add to your groups to make keys just that much more easier. The Disease Dispel is very, very strong, especially for certain dungeons like Plaguefall has a lot of really good disease dispels, as well as things like specific packs into Other Side. Having a good disease cleanse for your group and kind of monitoring when they can be dispelled is very, very important. Especially if you're running with a group that doesn't have another disease dispel, right? If you don't have a monk or another priest in your group, you want to make sure that you have access to this. Now, personally, I use Decursive to help me kind of quickly identify who can be dispelled with a disease. And if you can see on the kind of background footage behind me, right below my cast bar is like a thing with like a couple boxes on it that each one represents a group member, and I can easily just click that to dispel someone. I also have it keybounds where I can do that separately too. But that just makes it like easily like, hey, someone has a dispel that I can get rid of. I'm going to go ahead and take that or coordinate with my group members on that. So definitely something that you want to take advantage of there. Mass Dispel. You can only dispel 5 things with this, but again, it is very strong to do a kind of group-wide dispel for allies and enemies at the same time. Typically, though, this is going to be the healer's going to call for your Mass Dispel. So you do want to kind of coordinate with them like, hey guys, I'll cover this dispel. The healer can get the next set for things like the last boss of Spires of the Ascension and things like that. Other things to bring up here, we do have Psychic Core as a single target stun if you need that. Make sure to talent that if you need it. You can also go Last Word if you want a bit more of a frequent interrupt, although a bit less useful overall. We also have Vampiric Embrace, which, again, it's not the best heal in the world, but for certain things like the last boss of the other side, for example, when you're off on a platform without a healer, Vamp Embrace can be very nice for that. Or if the group is just a little low or the healer's busy or out of mana, the Vampiric Embrace is great for that. So make sure you're using that as effectively as possible. Really, the only thing I want to bring up here, in addition to kind of our Shadow Mender Powered Shield off healing, we do have access to Shackle Undead now, which there are kind of a reasonable handful of dungeons that do have undead mobs to give us an extra CC. Necrotic Wake is by far, I think, the best shining example of this. You can CC a lot of things in there with Shackle Undead to make packs a little bit less deadly, especially on the second boss. You can actually CC and add to make it much less deadly during the boss encounter to make that easier on your group, which is great to have that. And that, guys, that is the kind of TLDR of our utility, so make sure you guys are using those effectively. There's even more I didn't mention, like Mind Control, Leap of Faith, that are, situationally good. So there are some good things we have in our toolkit, just maybe not as useful as some other things. But again, still very competitive. All right, guys, that is it for this video. I hope this has helped you get ready for Mythic Plus as a Shadow Priest, answered all of your questions. If you still have more, I would suggest checking out the written guide. I'm constantly going to be adding and updating things on that. So if you're first looking at this, make sure you give that a look. Make sure there's nothing to change or anything else like that. But if you have other questions, please let me know in the comments below, or hit me up on Discord or wherever else. I've been trying my best to run as many keys as possible to give you guys that good information. And I will say, I know a lot of people have asked for this. Other YouTubers have done this as well. I plan on uploading like specific, like, hey, here's my 15 or whatever Theater of Pain, and here's my commentary of that dungeon. If that's something you want to see, just let me know. If that's what you guys like, I can do those. Start uploading those maybe in a couple days, so let me know. But that concludes this video, the guide series. Thank you so much to the patrons that are supporting me for this. I know it was kind of a weird upload schedule, but I was able to get through it with their awesome support. Could not have done it without you guys. Thank you so much. And please let me know what you guys want to see next. This is the end of the official guide series, but we have much more stuff planned coming soon. So again, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.